Get off my wagon, right now. I don't haul charity cases into Red Hollow." Clara Whitmore didn't beg. She stepped down into the mud without a word, pulled her soaked suitcase off the back herself, and lifted her 8-year-old son onto the ground beside her. The rain was coming down so hard she could barely see the buildings. Her boots filled with water. Her hands were shaking. 3 states, 300 miles, and every single person she'd asked for help had turned away. She had nothing left, except the one thing nobody could take the will to survive one more night. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and follow Clara all the way to the end, because I promise you what happens next will stay with you for a long time. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. Part 1. A Widow in the Rain. The wagon driver didn't even look back. Clara stood there in the middle of the road watching him go, rain hammering down on her shoulders, and she told herself not to cry. She had been telling herself not to cry for 11 months now. She was getting good at it. Eli pressed his small body against her side. He didn't say anything. He had stopped asking questions somewhere around the Kansas border, as if he'd figured out that she didn't have answers anymore, and that keeping quiet was how he could help her carry what she was carrying. She looked down at him. His hat was soaked through. His boots were too small. She had been meaning to get him new ones since July. "You cold?" she asked. "No, ma'am," he said. He was absolutely cold. She picked up the suitcase and walked. Red Hollow was not what she had hoped for. She had heard the name from a woman at a roadside boarding house in Cheyenne who said it like it was a place worth something, a cattle town with decent people, a church, a general store that gave fair prices. What Clara saw when she came around the bend was a main street that looked like it had been through a fire and hadn't entirely decided to recover. 2 of the storefronts were boarded shut. The saloon was the only building with real light pouring out of it. A dog that was mostly bones watched her from beneath a broken bench. She kept walking. The trading post had a covered porch, and she steered Eli toward it just to get out of the worst of the rain for a minute. She needed to think. She had $4.32 left. She had 3 dresses in the suitcase, a sewing kit, a photograph of her late husband Thomas, and a stack of letters she was hoping never to read again, letters from a man named Greer back in Missouri, who said Thomas owed him $400 before he died, and that the debt now belonged to her. She leaned against the post and tried to breathe. "You're blocking the entrance." She looked up. A woman in a flour-dusted apron stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, eyeing Clara the way people eye a stray cat who looks like it might stay. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "We just need a moment out of the rain. We won't be long." "Where are you coming from?" "Missouri originally, most recently Cheyenne." "You got family here?" "No, ma'am." "You got money?" Clara straightened her spine. "I have enough." That was the kind of lie that had kept her moving for 11 months. She'd gotten skilled at delivering it without flinching. The woman studied her for another few seconds, then looked at Eli. Something shifted slightly in her face. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of hostility, which at this point Clara had learned to count as a victory. "There's no boarding house in Red Hollow anymore," the woman said. "Closed last spring. Mabel, who ran it, died and nobody's picked it up." "Is there somewhere I could stay?" "Even short term? I'm a seamstress. I can pay in work if needed." "Seamstress." The woman repeated it like she was considering it. "Hattie over at the church takes in women sometimes. You could try her." "Where's the church?" "End of the road, turn left past the fence that's falling down. You'll know it because it looks like everything else around here tired." Clara thanked her and pulled Eli back out into the rain. She found the church. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. A curtain moved inside, then stilled. Nobody came to the door. She stood on that step for longer than she should have because she was so tired her legs didn't want to move anymore. Eli leaned against the doorframe and closed his eyes. She watched his chest rise and fall. He hadn't eaten since noon, a half piece of bread, and an apple she'd traded a mending job for at the last stop. "Come on, baby," she said quietly. She didn't know where she was going. She started back toward the main street. That was when she noticed the man. He was standing under the porch of the trading post, where she'd been earlier, completely still, watching her with the kind of attention that wasn't threatening, just absolute. He was tall, weathered in the way that Wyoming men got weathered, like the territory itself had pressed its thumb into him and left a mark. He had dark eyes that caught the lantern light from inside the store, and a jaw that looked like it hadn't decided whether to clench or let go. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't scowling. He was just watching. Clara met his eyes because she had learned that looking away first gave men ideas about what kind of woman you were. He walked toward her. She tightened her grip on Eli's hand. "You're looking for a place to stay," the man said. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine," Clara said. "You've knocked on the church door twice. Hattie doesn't answer after dark anymore, not since her husband passed." He paused. "I'm not trying to frighten you. I've got a ranch house 2 miles out. There's a room off the kitchen that nobody uses. You and your boy could shelter there until you get sorted." Clara stared at him. "I don't know you. Wade Mercer. I've got 20 head of cattle, a dog named August, and I haven't done anything worth being afraid of since 1879. He seemed to think about that for a second. "My word on it." "Your word." She almost laughed, but it came out wrong, sharper than she intended. "Sir, I have ridden 300 miles on the word of people who turned out to mean very little. You'll forgive me if I don't find that particularly reassuring." He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He just looked at her steadily and said, "That's fair." The rain was coming down harder. Eli coughed a small, tired sound that cut right through Clara and filled her chest with the particular terror that only a mother knows. She looked down at him. His lips were pale. She looked back at Wade Mercer. 2 miles, she said. 2 miles, he confirmed. "I've got a horse and a wagon around back. Takes about 20 minutes in this weather." She stood there for 5 full seconds, making the calculation, measuring what she had against what she stood to lose. "If you're lying," she said finally, "I want you to know I am not a woman who goes quietly." He almost smiled. It didn't quite reach full expression, just a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, like a man who had forgotten how and was remembering slowly. "I believe you," he said. The ranch house was plain and cold and smelled like years of solitude, wood smoke and leather, and the absence of any woman's presence for a very long time. But it was dry. The roof held. There was a wood stove in the kitchen that Wade had banked before he left that morning, and it came back to life with 2 pieces of split oak and a little coaxing. Clara sat Eli next to it and pulled off his wet boots herself, rubbing his feet between her hands until the color came back. Wade set a pot of coffee on without being asked. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. There was something almost careful about the silence between them, like 2 people who had both learned that words cost things, and you didn't spend them until you meant them. Eli fell asleep sitting up in the chair within 10 minutes of getting warm. Clara lifted him, carried him to the small room Wade had indicated off the kitchen. A simple bed, a quilt that was old but clean, a window with the curtain drawn, and laid him down without waking him. She pulled the quilt up to his chin. She stood there for a moment in the dark, one hand resting on his chest, feeling him breathe. She let herself shake for about 15 seconds. Just 15. It was all she allowed. Then she straightened up and walked back to the kitchen. Wade was sitting at the table with 2 tin cups of coffee. He pushed one toward the empty chair without looking at her. She sat. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I'll earn this," she said. "I don't take charity. I cook, I sew, I mend. Whatever your men need." He looked up at her. Something flickered in those dark eyes, not offense, not amusement. Something harder to name. "I've got 2 ranch hands," he said. "Both of them couldn't sew a button on if their lives depended on it. And I can't cook anything that doesn't taste like boot leather." Then we have an arrangement, Clara said. He nodded once. We have an arrangement. She drank the coffee. It was strong and slightly burnt, and it was the best thing she had tasted in weeks. She woke the next morning before dawn, old habit from years of being a seamstress on commission. She heard the ranch hands outside before she heard anything else. Boots on hard ground, low voices, the particular sounds of men who start work early, because the land doesn't wait for you to feel ready. She built the fire in the kitchen stove, found the larder, and assessed what she had to work with. Flour-dried beans, some salt pork eggs from a small coop she could see through the window. Not much. Enough. When Wade came in from the first check of the morning, she had cornbread in the pan and beans heating in the pot. He stopped in the doorway. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I told you I would." He sat. She set the food in front of him. He ate it. He didn't compliment it, didn't make conversation, didn't do anything except eat like a man who was used to silence with his meals. She decided she didn't mind that. She'd had 10 years of a husband who filled every silence with his own voice, and very little of what he said was worth hearing. Eli appeared in the doorway, hair still pressed flat from sleep, his eyes wide and uncertain as he took in a kitchen that wasn't his own, and a man he didn't know. "Morning," Wade said. He didn't force a smile. He just said it plainly, like he said most things. Eli looked at Clara. "Sit down, Eli," she said. "Eat your breakfast." Eli sat. He watched Wade the way a small animal watches something it hasn't classified yet, not afraid exactly, but attentive. Calculating. Wade reached across the table without ceremony and pushed the larger piece of cornbread toward Eli's plate. Eli looked at it, looked at Wade. "Thank you," he said quietly. Wade just nodded and went back to his coffee. Clara watched that small exchange from across the kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt in almost a year. Not happiness, she wasn't ready for that yet. Something quieter. Something that just barely resembled the distant memory of safety. She turned back to the stove before either of them could see her face. By the end of the first week, a routine had established itself the way routines do not, through agreement, but through repetition. Clara cooked mornings and evenings. Eli helped where he could, carrying wood and feeding the chickens, because Clara believed a child needed to feel useful, and Eli had too much of his mother in him to be comfortable sitting still. Wade ran his ranch. His two hands, a young man named Cord, and an older Mexican cowboy called Delgado, who had worked for Wade for 9 years, treated Clara with the careful respect of men who had been given no instructions either way and decided polite was the safest approach. But the town was another thing entirely. The first time Clara walked into the general store in Red Hollow, the woman at the counter, Mrs. Albrecht, she learned later, watched her the whole time with an expression that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite judgment, but was the particular kind of female scrutiny that Clara recognized from every new town she'd ever tried to settle in. "You're the woman staying out at Mercer's place," Mrs. Albrecht said when Clara brought her purchases to the counter. It was not a question. "I'm renting the back room and providing cooking and mending in exchange," Clara said evenly. "It's a working arrangement." Mrs. Albrecht wrapped her purchases without another word. Clara didn't flinch. She had been talked about before. She would be talked about again. What she refused to do was apologize for surviving. She was almost to the door when the bell above it jangled and a man walked in, broad-shouldered, well-dressed in the particular way that came from money rather than from working in it, with the easy confidence of someone who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around his arrival. He stopped when he saw her. "I don't believe we've met," he said. And the smile he put on was the kind Clara had seen on men who considered themselves charming and hadn't been told otherwise in too long. "Randall Holt. I'm developing some of the land projects in this valley." "Clara Whitmore," she said. "Whitmore." He tilted his head. "Not from here originally." "No." "Passing through, deciding," she said, which was true enough. Something in his expression shifted barely just a flicker when she said that, like information being filed away somewhere behind those pleasant eyes. "Well," he said, "Red Hollow can always use people willing to put down roots, as long as they pick the right spot." He smiled again. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore." She walked out into the cold and didn't let herself think about what was wrong with him until she was halfway back to the ranch. Then she thought about it carefully. His boots were too clean. A man who was genuinely working land projects in a Wyoming cattle town didn't have boots that clean. He was performing something. She had been married to a man who performed things, and she had learned too late. But she had learned to notice the difference between a man being himself and a man being what he wanted you to see. She filed it away. She was 2 weeks into the arrangement when she found the papers. She wasn't snooping. She needed more thread, and she'd seen a sewing tin in the sideboard drawer the night before when she was looking for a spoon. She opened the drawer and found the tin, and underneath it, loose papers that had been folded in a hurry and shoved to the back. She almost closed the drawer. She didn't. She pulled one out just far enough to read the header. Purchase agreement. Wyoming Territory. Land acquisition. Final and binding. The name on the document wasn't Wade's. It was a woman's name, Adeline Foss. And beside it, a signature that looked wrong shaky, in a way that suggested either illness or fear or something else entirely. And below it, a notary seal dated 2 weeks ago. Clara had done enough sewing work for law offices in Missouri to recognize a legitimate contract. She had also done enough to recognize one that wasn't. This felt like the second kind. She put it back, carefully, exactly as she'd found it. She stood there in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she went and found Wade. He was in the barn with Delgado checking on a mare that had been favoring her left foreleg. She stood in the entrance and waited until he looked up. "Do you know a woman named Adeline Foss?" she asked. Something changed in his face. Not dramatically. Wade Mercer didn't do things dramatically. But the set of his jaw shifted, and his eyes went from the mare to Clara with a kind of focused attention that told her the name meant something to him. "She's a widow about 3 miles north," he said slowly. "Runs a small spread on her own since her husband passed in the spring. Why? I found a purchase agreement in your sideboard. Her name is on it." She held his gaze. "The signature doesn't look right, Wade." The word came out before she decided to use his first name. He noticed she could tell by the way something in his expression shifted, but he didn't comment on it. "What do you mean doesn't look right?" he said. "I mean it looks like someone who was frightened, or someone who didn't understand what they were signing." She paused. "Those documents shouldn't be in your house. Do you know how they got there?" He walked toward her, not aggressively, deliberately, like a man trying to understand the shape of a problem before he reacted to it. "I found them in the road 2 days ago," he said quietly. "Holt's men dropped a satchel off one of their wagons. Papers spilled out. I picked them up, meaning to return them, and then He stopped. "I read one, and I didn't return them." She looked at him. "Because they're wrong," she said. "Because they're wrong," he confirmed. There was a long beat of silence between them. Outside, the wind picked up and threw a handful of sleet against the barn wall like a fist. "There are more of them," she said. "In the satchel. 12 documents," he said. 12 different landowners, half of them widows, half of them immigrants, who may not have read what they were signing." His voice was low and controlled, but underneath it was something that sounded like barely suppressed fury. "They're being bought out for 1/4 of what their land is worth, and they're all signed within the last month." "Holt," Clara said. "Holt," he confirmed. She stood there, and she felt the shape of it all settle around her. The 2 clean boots, the easy smile, the word deciding, filed away behind pleasant eyes. She felt the cold of it in her chest. "Those women thought they were signing something fair," she said. "Didn't they?" It wasn't a question. "I think they were told they were," Wade said, "and I think some of them were told they had no other choice." She looked up at him, then really looked at him. This quiet man with his cold house and his scarred silences, standing in his barn, holding a truth that could burn the whole valley down if anyone lit it right. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He looked back at her with those dark eyes that gave away very little except when they gave away everything. "I don't know yet," he said. "What are you going to do?" She hadn't expected him to turn it back on her. She hadn't expected to feel the weight of it land in her chest like it belonged there. She thought about Adeline Foss, 3 miles north alone, since spring holding a piece of paper she probably didn't fully understand, and a future that was being quietly taken from her, while men in clean boots smiled and called it opportunity. She thought about herself 11 months ago, sitting across a desk from a man named Greer, who also had clean boots and a pleasant face, and told her that the debt was hers now, and smiled while he said it. "I'm going to help you," Clara said. Wade was quiet for a long moment. "You understand what that means," he said. "Holt isn't a man who likes to be interfered with." "I'm not a woman who frightens easily," she said. "You already know that." Something in his expression did it again, that almost not quite thing, that wasn't yet a smile, but was the shape a smile might someday take in a man who'd forgotten he was capable of one. "Yeah," he said softly. "I do." That night, after Eli was asleep and the ranch was quiet, Clara sat at the kitchen table, with the satchel of documents spread in front of her, and Wade sitting across from her with a lantern between them. They went through every page. She read the legal language while he tracked the names and dates. They didn't talk much. They worked, and the working felt like something like a shape of purpose. She hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. At some point, past midnight, Delgado appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at what was on the table, poured himself a cup of cold coffee, and sat down without being asked. "Holt's man came to my cousin in Laramie last summer," he said quietly. "Same kind of papers. She signed because she was scared. Lost the land by September." Nobody said anything for a moment. "We have to tell the others," Clara said. "The women on this list. They need to know what they signed." "Holt will know," Wade said. "The minute we start talking, he'll know." "Then we move fast," she said. He looked at her across the lantern light. The flame threw shadows across his face, and for just a second, in the way the light caught his eyes, she could see something there that he didn't let out very often. Not just anger, not just determination. Something older than both of those. Something that had been waiting a long time for a reason to move. "Fast," he agreed. Clara looked back down at the papers. 12 names. 12 families. 12 lives being quietly stolen by a man with clean boots who called himself a developer. She thought, this is not why I came to Red Hollow. And then she thought, but maybe it's why I stayed. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table long after Wade and Delgado had gone to bed, and she went through every document in that satchel a second time, then a third. She wasn't looking for new information, she'd already found what was there. She was looking for the thing she always looked for when something felt wrong the seam. The place where the lie showed through if you pressed on it long enough. She found it on the 6th document. The notary seal was identical on all 12 papers. Not similar. Identical, the same tiny imperfection on the lower left edge of the stamp. The same pressure mark, like a man pressing down just slightly harder than necessary on the right side. 12 different signings. 12 different dates spanning 6 weeks. One seal. One forged seal. She set the paper down very carefully, the way you set down something that might break if you're not careful. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. She had just found the evidence that could send Randall Holt to prison. She had also just found the reason he would do absolutely anything to make sure nobody talked. She told Wade at breakfast. She set the 2 documents side by side in front of him without saying a word and let him look. She watched his face while he studied them, watched the moment he saw what she saw, watched his jaw set so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. Cord was there too, leaning against the counter with his coffee, and he leaned in to look and then made a sound low in his throat that wasn't quite a word. "That's the same stamp," Cord said. "Yes," Clara said. "All 12. All 12. Wade looked up from the papers. His eyes went to Clara's face with an expression she was starting to recognize, that particular focused stillness he used instead of showing everything he felt. "That's not a man cutting corners," he said. "That's a man running a system." "He's done this before," Clara said. "Delgado's cousin in Laramie. How many other counties? How many other towns that were already struggling before he arrived?" Silence. "We need to get these documents somewhere safe," Wade said. "Not here." "Agreed. And we need to talk to Adeline Foss before Holt does." Wade stood up from the table. "I'll ride out this morning." "I'm coming with you," Clara said. He looked at her. There was a brief pause. Not hesitation exactly, more like the recalibration of a man who had spent a long time making all his decisions alone. "All right," he said. Eli looked up from his cornbread with the particular alertness of a child who has learned to read the air in a room. "Can I come?" "No," Clara and Wade said simultaneously. Eli looked between them. Then he went back to his cornbread with a small private expression that in another context might have been satisfaction. Adeline Foss was 43 years old and moved like a woman who had learned to carry grief without letting it show in her posture. She opened her door and took one look at Wade and one look at Clara, and then she looked at the papers Clara was holding, and something in her face went very still. "Come in," she said quietly. Inside, she made coffee she probably couldn't spare, and she listened without interrupting while Clara explained what they'd found. When Clara was done, Adeline sat with her hands wrapped around her cup and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I knew something was wrong when I signed it. I knew. But he had 2 men with him, and one of them had a gun on his hip, and he kept saying it was the best offer I was going to get before winter." Her voice was flat and controlled. "I have 2 daughters, ages 9 and 11. I thought if I fight this and he takes it anyway, at least I'll have the money. At least the girls will eat." Clara felt something hot and quiet move through her chest. "He counted on that," she said. "He picked women who were scared. He counted on you not having anyone to ask." Adeline looked at her. "And now you have someone to ask," Clara said. "My kind." By the end of that week, they had visited 4 of the 12 families on the documents. A widow named Ruth Kane, who ran a small homestead with her teenage son. An immigrant Czech couple, the Novaks, who had spoken barely enough English to understand the contract, and had signed because a man in a suit seemed official, and official seemed safe. A retired cavalryman named Herschel Pruitt, who had lost 2 fingers on his right hand, and signed the papers with his left, which explained a certain shakiness that had nothing to do with fear. Every single one of them said some version of the same thing. Men with guns on their hips. The best offer before winter. No one to ask. Wade rode. Clara talked. It was an efficient division of labor that neither of them had discussed. It had simply emerged like the morning routine had through repetition, and a shared understanding of who was better at what. On the ride back from the Pruitt place, Clara said, "We need to find the federal marshal's office. Not the county sheriff, he knows Holt. I could see it in the way Mrs. Albrecht talked about land dealings last week. Whatever Holt is running, he's already bought some of the local authority." Wade was quiet for a moment, the horse moving steadily beneath him. "Nearest federal office is in Cheyenne." "How long a ride?" 2 days, maybe less if the weather holds." She thought about that. "We can't send the documents in a letter. If they get intercepted." "Someone has to go in person," he said. "Yes." He glanced sideways at her. "I'll go." "Not alone," she said. "Clara." It was the first time he'd used her name without being prompted. She noticed. She was fairly sure he noticed too, but they were both moving too fast to stop for it. "You've got Eli. You can't ride 2 days to Cheyenne and leave him." She opened her mouth, closed it. He was right, and she hated that he was right. "Delgado," she said finally. "Send Delgado with the documents. Someone Holt's men won't be looking for." Wade considered it. That puts Delgado at risk. He already knows. He's already at risk. Another long silence. The wind her coat, and she pulled it tighter. I'll talk to him tonight, Wade said. Delgado said yes, without being asked twice. He said it the way he said most things, simply without theater. And then he asked for the fastest horse and a second rifle, and that was the end of the discussion. He left before dawn the next morning. Cord watched him go from the barn doorway and then turned to Wade and said, "You know Holt's going to find out we're moving." "Yes," Wade said. "What do we do when he does?" Wade looked at him steadily. "We stand our ground." Cord chewed on that for a second. "That ain't much of a plan." "It's enough of one for right now," Wade said. Mamlag. What Clara hadn't counted on was the town. She'd been in Red Hollow 3 weeks when she walked into the trading post to find 3 women she didn't know waiting for her. Not hostile waiting, like they'd been told she would come and they had arranged themselves to be there when she did. The one who spoke first was a sharp-eyed woman of about 60, named Frances Greer, no relation to the Greer back in Missouri. Clara confirmed internally with a small, careful relief who ran the town's only remaining laundry. "We heard you've been talking to Adeline Foss," Frances said. Clara didn't deny it. "I have." "And the Novaks?" "Yes." "And Ruth Kane?" "Yes." Frances looked at the 2 women with her and then back at Clara. "We've been watching what Holt's been doing for 2 months. We just didn't know what to do about it." Clara studied her. "What changed?" "You did," Frances said. "You showed up." She said it without sentimentality, just as a fact. Somebody from outside who doesn't owe Holt anything, and doesn't have anything he's already taken. That's different. Clara felt the weight of that settle on her, in a way she hadn't fully anticipated the responsibility of being the person who arrives with nothing and is therefore trusted by everyone. It was a strange kind of power, and it didn't come with any guarantees. "I need to know everything you know about him," Clara said. "All of it. When he came, who he's talked to, which officials he's met with." Frances pulled a chair up. "Sit down. This is going to take a while." Tug. It took 2 hours. By the end of it, Clara had a picture of Randall Holt that was considerably larger and darker than the one she'd assembled from documents alone. He had arrived in Red Hollow 4 months ago with a story about a railroad spur that would make the valley worth 10 times what it was. He had been pleasant. He had bought drinks at the saloon. He had attended church twice. He had been, by all appearances, exactly the kind of outside investor that a struggling cattle town desperately wanted to believe in. And then quietly, family by family, he had begun. "The sheriff," Clara said. "Bolin." Frances's mouth pressed flat. "Bolin rode out to Holt's camp twice last month. Came back both times with what looked like a full saddlebag." "He's bought," Clara said. "He's bought," Frances confirmed. Clara thought for a moment. "There's a town meeting scheduled for next week, the one about the water rights proposal." "Yes." "Every landowner in the valley will be there." Frances looked at her with those sharp eyes. "What are you thinking?" Clara looked back at her steadily. "I'm thinking that 12 families who signed documents under pressure have a right to know what they signed. And I'm thinking that Holt would very much prefer that conversation didn't happen in a room full of people." "He won't let it happen quietly," Frances said. "No," Clara agreed. "He won't." The 2 women looked at each other across the table in a moment that felt like the closing of a fist, slow, deliberate, and final. "I'm going to need help," Clara said. "You have it," Frances said. She didn't tell Wade what she was planning until that evening. She thought about not telling him at all, about simply doing it and dealing with his reaction afterward. But something in her had shifted over the past 3 weeks, some internal accounting she hadn't fully noticed happening. And when she tried to picture moving forward without telling him, it felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite explain. She found him in the barn after dinner doing the last check of the animals, and she stood in the doorway and told him about Frances and what she intended to do at the town meeting. When she was finished, he didn't say anything for a long moment. He was checking the water trough, and he just stood there with his back to her for a few seconds, in the particular silence that she was learning was not coldness, it was processing. Wade Mercer did not react to things. He absorbed them, turned them over, and then came out with something deliberate. He turned around. "Holt will be at that meeting," he said. "I know. He's going to know before you finish talking that those documents were in your hands. He's going to know it was you." "Yes. And Eli." His voice shifted almost imperceptibly on the name just a fraction of a shade softer. "Clara. If Holt decides to move against you, what's the alternative?" she said. "Those 12 families keep losing their land. Adeline Foss loses the only thing her husband left for those girls. The Novaks go back to nothing because they didn't speak enough English to know they were being stolen from." She held his gaze. "You already made this choice when you didn't return that satchel, Wade. You made it the moment you read those papers and understood what they were." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. It wasn't an insult either. It was something in between, a kind of raw acknowledgement, man to woman, equal to equal. "I've been called worse," she said. His mouth did the almost smile again, and this time it got a little further than it usually did. "I'll be at the meeting," he said. "Right beside you." She hadn't asked him to be. She hadn't needed to. She turned to go and then stopped because something had been sitting in the back of her mind for 3 weeks and it suddenly pressed forward harder than she could hold it down. "Wade." He looked at her. "Why did you really offer me that room?" she asked. "The night I came in. You don't know me. I could have been anyone. And you walked across that street in the rain and offered a stranger a place to sleep." She watched his face carefully. "Nobody does that for nothing. What did you see?" The silence that followed was different from his usual kind. This one had texture to it, not emptiness, but weight. He looked down at the straw beneath his boots for just a second. Then he looked back up. "I saw someone who wasn't going to ask for help," he said quietly. Not because she didn't need it. Because she'd already asked too many people, and too many of them had let her down. He paused. "I recognize that. That's all." She held very still. "That's all," she repeated softly. "That's all," he said. She nodded once. She walked back to the house. She did not let herself think about what lived underneath those words until she was alone. Then she let herself think about it just for a moment, and then she put it somewhere safe and went to check on Eli. Delgado came back on the 7th day. He came back without the documents, which was right, and with a name, Marshal Benjamin Cook, federal officer, who had received the evidence and confirmed receipt, and said in Delgado's recounting that he knew the name Randall Holt from 2 other territories and had been waiting for exactly this kind of paper trail. Wade received this news standing in the yard with his arms crossed, and something in his expression shifted. Not relief. Not yet, because they weren't near the end of this thing, but the recognition that the first piece had landed. "How long before Cook moves?" Clara asked. Delgado shook his head. He said weeks, maybe more. He has to build the federal case properly or Holt's lawyers walk him out the door. Weeks. The town meeting was in 4 days. Clara looked at Wade. He looked at her. In 4 days, she was going to stand up in front of every landowner in that valley and tell them what she knew. And Delgado had just confirmed that the man she was about to expose had beaten 2 other territorial investigations before this one. "He's going to know before the meeting's over," Cord said from the barn door, where he'd been listening with the focused expression of a young man trying to keep up with a situation moving faster than he'd expected. "The moment you start talking, Holt's going to know everything's blown." "Yes," Clara said. "So what do we do?" Clara looked at Delgado, then at Cord, then at Wade. "We make sure that when he knows," she said, "it's already too late for him to do anything about it." Nobody asked her to explain that yet. There wasn't time. The weather was turning. The meeting was 4 days out, and somewhere on the edge of this valley, A man with clean boots and a very organized operation was about to discover that a widow from Missouri had spent the last 3 weeks building something he hadn't anticipated. Not an argument, not a complaint, a case. And Clara learned in 11 months of surviving on her own that the difference between a woman who gets walked over and a woman who doesn't is very simple. One of them does her homework before she opens her mouth. She had done her homework. She was ready. The morning of the town meeting, Clara woke up with the particular kind of calm that only comes right before something breaks. She had felt it once before, the morning she buried Thomas. That absolute stillness before the world rearranges itself into a shape you don't recognize yet. She had learned then that the calm wasn't peace. It was the body's way of gathering everything it had left before the moment arrived. She dressed without waking Eli. She went to the kitchen and built the fire and stood at the stove with her hands around a tin cup, and she ran through it one more time. Every name on the documents, every date, the notary seal and its identical imperfection across all 12 pages. The testimony she'd collected from Adeline, from Ruth Kane, from the Novaks, from Herschel Pruitt. Not written down because written things could be taken, but memorized word by word, the way she had once memorized patterns for dresses she couldn't afford to cut wrong. She was ready. She told herself she was ready. The door opened, and Wade came in from the early check bringing cold air and the smell of frost with him. He looked at her standing at the stove and didn't say good morning. He just said, "Today's the day." "Today's the day," she confirmed. He poured himself coffee and stood beside her, not close enough to be anything other than two people sharing a stove's warmth, but close enough that she was aware of him, the way she'd been increasingly aware of him for the past week, in a manner she absolutely refused to name. "Holt will have men in that room," he said. "I know. If it goes sideways." "It won't go sideways," she said. Then more honestly, "And if it does, we handle it." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not afraid of anything, are you?" "I'm afraid of plenty," she said. "I just don't let it make my decisions." He was quiet. Then he said very low in a voice that wasn't his rancher's voice or his practical voice, but something closer to the thing underneath both of those. "Whatever happens in there today, Clara, whatever he does after you and Eli are not alone in this. You understand me." She understood him. She understood him so clearly it was almost unbearable. And she nodded once without looking at him, because looking at him in that moment would have cost her something she needed to hold on to for the next 8 hours. The church hall was packed by the time they arrived. Clara had not expected that. She had expected a decent turnout. It was a water rights meeting, which mattered to every rancher in the valley, but the hall was standing room only. People pressed shoulder to shoulder along the walls. And when she walked in with Wade and Cord and Delgado behind her, she felt the shift in the room immediately. People noticed. The kind of noticing that meant word had already traveled. Frances caught her eye from across the room and gave one short nod. She had done what she'd said she would do quietly, efficiently, without fanfare. Every family on the document list had been reached. Every one of them was here. Holt was here too. He was standing near the front with 2 men on either side of him, and he was smiling, the way he always smiled. Pleasant, practiced, utterly impenetrable. When he saw Clara, the smile didn't change. Not by a fraction. That she thought was the tell of a man who had been in rooms like this before and come out the other side. He wasn't surprised to see her. He'd known she was coming. The question was, what he planned to do about it. Sheriff Bolin called the meeting to order at 10 o'clock. He went through the water rights agenda with the laborious efficiency of a man who had been told to keep things moving and wanted it over. Clara stood near the back and waited with her hands folded and her face perfectly still. 15 minutes in, Bolin asked for any additional business. Clara raised her hand. Bolin looked at her. Something uncomfortable moved through his face. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Thank you, Sheriff." She walked to the front of the room. She could feel the attention of every person in that hall tracking her as she moved. Curiosity tension, the held breath of people who sensed something was about to happen and weren't sure yet if it was the thing they'd been hoping for or dreading. She turned and faced them, I want to talk about the land purchase agreements that have been circulating in this valley for the past 6 weeks, she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried and filled every corner of the room. Specifically, I want to talk about the ones signed by 12 families. Here, families who were told they were receiving fair market value for their property and who were not. The room stirred. Holt's smile didn't move. Mrs. Whitmore. That was Holt's voice, smooth, generous, the voice of a man who had learned to sound reasonable under pressure. I think there may be some confusion about the nature of those agreements. They were entirely voluntary. They were signed under duress, Clara said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. And they contain a fraudulent notary seal, the same seal with the same physical defect on all 12 documents across 6 weeks of supposedly separate signings. Silence. Not the silence of a room that doesn't believe her. The silence of a room that does. That's a serious accusation, Bolin said, and his voice had gone flat in a way that told Clara exactly where his loyalties lived. It's a documented fact, she said, which is currently in the hands of Federal Marshal Benjamin Cook in Cheyenne, along with signed testimony from 8 of the 12 families present in this room today. That was the moment everything shifted. Holt moved not toward her, not yet, but the quality of his stillness changed. The 2 men beside him exchanged a look that was too fast and too practiced to be anything but rehearsed. The pleasant face didn't crack, but something behind it recalculated fast and cold and invisible to anyone who hadn't been watching for it. Clara had been watching for it. "Adeline Foss," she said, turning to face the room. "Would you stand up, please?" Adeline stood, quietly, with her chin up and her hands at her sides. Ruth Kane. Ruth stood. Pavel and Marta Novak. They stood together, Pavel's hand finding Marta's. One by one, Clara called each family. One by one they stood. By the time she reached the 12th name, the room had changed shape entirely. What had been a water rights meeting had become something else, something older and more serious, a community deciding what it was made of. Holt stepped forward. "This woman," he said, not Clara's name, just this woman, which told her exactly how rattled he was beneath the surface, "has been living on Wade Mercer's property for less than a month. She has no standing in this valley, no property, no—" "She has the truth," Wade said from the back of the room. Nobody had heard Wade Mercer raise his voice in years. He didn't raise it now exactly, but it carried the way quiet things carry, when a room is listening hard enough. "And she's not standing alone," Wade said. He walked forward until he was standing beside her. Cord came with him. Delgado. Francis. And then from different parts of the room, other people began to move, not dramatically, not with speeches, just the quiet, deliberate repositioning of people choosing a side. Holt looked at the room, at Clara, at Wade. For just 1 second, the pleasant face was gone entirely. Then Bolin said loudly, "This meeting is adjourned," and the moment broke. "Martin say." Holt left without another word, which was the thing that frightened Clara most. Not a threat, not an outburst, just the controlled exit of a man who was already thinking about what came next. She watched him go, and felt the cold move through her chest, the way it had moved through her on the night she'd first read those documents. "He's not finished," she said quietly to Wade as the room began to empty. "No," Wade said. "He's not." "How long before he moves?" "Not long." He paused. "We need to get you and Eli somewhere." "Don't," she said sharply. He stopped. "Don't make decisions about where I go," she said, not angry, clear, the way she said everything when it mattered. "I'm not going to hide Wade. I'm not going to disappear and wait for men to handle this. That is not who I am, and you know it by now." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he exhaled, not defeated, not exasperated. Something closer to a man adjusting to a reality he respected, even when it made his life harder. "All right," he said. "Then we go back to the ranch together, and we don't leave it unguarded. Not tonight." They rode back in the early dark, 5 of them. Wade, Clara, Cord Delgado and Eli, who had been left with Francis during the meeting and picked up on the way out of town, and who had read every adult face with the precision of a child who had spent a year and a half learning that adult faces contained information they didn't always say out loud. In the wagon beside her, Eli put his hand over hers. She turned it over and held it. The hours of the night were quiet. Too quiet in the way that Clara had learned the way the territory itself sometimes held its breath before something moved through it. Cord took the first watch. Delgado the second. Wade didn't sleep, which Clara knew because she didn't sleep either, and she could hear him moving boots on the kitchen floor. The low creak of the chair. The sound of a man sitting with the particular stillness of someone who is not resting, but waiting. She got up at midnight and went to the kitchen. He was at the table. He had a rifle across his knees and a cup of cold coffee at his elbow, and he looked up when she came in with an expression that said he wasn't surprised she was awake. She sat down across from him. "Tell me about her," Clara said. He didn't ask who she meant. He had probably known for weeks that she'd sensed it, the ghost that lived in this house, the shape of an absence that explained everything about how he moved through rooms and kept his distance, and never let himself fully land anywhere. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Her name was Grace. We were engaged to be married in the spring of 1878. She came out on the cattle drive with her father against everyone's advice, including mine." He stopped. There was a crossing. The river was running high. Her horse went down. Clara didn't say she was sorry. She waited. "I got to her," he said. "I got to her, but it was already." He stopped again. The muscle in his jaw worked once. "She died 3 days later. Fever." The kitchen was very still. "I packed up everything that reminded me of being someone who wanted things," he said. "And I've been running this ranch like that ever since. Not living in it, just running it." "Until a widow showed up in the rain," Clara said softly. He looked at her across the table, and the lantern between them caught his face fully, no shadow to hide and no distance left to maintain. "Until a widow showed up in the rain," he said, "and wouldn't let me keep the house cold." She held his gaze. She felt the weight of everything that moment contained pressing against her chest with a quiet insistence she didn't know how to ignore anymore. She was going to say something she didn't know yet exactly what, when the sound hit. A crack. Sharp and too loud for weather. Then Cord's voice from outside cut off sharply, in a way that sent ice straight through her blood. Wade was on his feet before the sound finished. "Get Eli," he said. "Right now. Don't stop, don't look outside. Wade. Clara. Get Eli." She ran. She had Eli out of bed in 10 seconds, pulled him up by his arm, blanket still around him, his eyes wide and confused and trusting in that heartbreaking way he had, because he had learned to trust her timing, even when he didn't understand it. She got them both to the back of the house, into the corner of the kitchen by the heavy stone wall, and pressed Eli down behind the table. "Don't move," she told him. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." "Mama, Eli." She took his face in her hands. "Look at me. You're brave. You've always been brave. Don't move until I come back for you." She left him there and went. The smell hit her before she reached the door. Smoke thick and immediate coming from the wrong direction. Not the stove. Outside. She pushed through the door and stopped. The barn. The whole east wall was catching orange and climbing fast, eating the dry wood with a voracity that told her it hadn't started accidentally. She could hear the animals, the horse screaming, the low, terrified sounds of the cattle, and over all of it, Delgado shouting in Spanish, and then in English, and then in Spanish again. She ran toward it. "Delgado, the horses." "Already I got 2 out." He was coughing, his face black with smoke. "There's one still inside Mercer's mare." "Where's Wade?" Delgado looked at her, and in his face she saw the thing she wasn't prepared for. "He went in after her," he said. The world stopped for exactly 1 second. Then Clara was moving toward the barn door. Delgado caught her arm. "Mrs. Whitmore, you cannot—" "Let go of me." She said it in a voice she didn't recognize, a voice from somewhere below. Fear. Below thought. Below everything except the single fact that Wade was inside a burning building. "Let go of me right now, Delgado." He let go. She pulled her coat over her face and went in. The heat was enormous, a physical pressure, not just temperature, the kind of heat that pushes back against you like a wall. She couldn't see more than 10 feet. She followed the sound of the mare still screaming somewhere to the left, and she moved toward it, crouching below the worst of the smoke, and she called his name. Wade. Nothing. Wade. And then, through the smoke and the roar of the fire eating the roof above her, his voice. Here. She found him on the ground behind the mare's stall. He had gotten the horse's lead loose, but the animal had panicked, and he'd taken a blow from her hindquarters. She could see it in the way he was holding his left side, the way he was up on one knee, but couldn't get to his feet. She got under his arm without discussion. "Leave me." "Stop talking," she said. "Walk." He walked. She moved them both toward the door. The mare following, now terrified, but following, and behind her, she could hear the roof beginning to give the specific sound of old timber losing its argument with fire, and she moved faster than she had ever moved in her life. They came through the barn door and onto the ground. And then Delgado was there, and Cord was alive. She noted with a rush of relief, so physical it nearly dropped her, and between them, they got Wade down onto the ground, 10 yards from the barn, and the roof of the east wall collapsed inward in a cascade of sparks that lit the night like something terrible and beautiful all at once. Clara knelt beside Wade. She got both hands on his face, not gentle, just immediate checking. His eyes were open, focused. "I'm all right," he said. "You are not all right. Couple of cracked ribs, maybe." He tried to breathe deeply and winced. "All right. Not entirely all right." She kept her hands on his face, and she looked at him. Really looked at him. And in that moment, all the careful distances she'd been maintaining collapsed as quietly and completely as that barn wall, and she was too exhausted and too scared to rebuild them tonight. "Don't do that again," she said. Her voice had gone rough at the edges. "You hear me? Don't ever do that again." He looked up at her through the smoke and the firelight with an expression that had nothing practiced or guarded in it, just a man stripped down to the center of what he actually felt. "I hear you," he said, and then very quietly, in a voice she had to lean forward to catch. "I saw you that night in the rain, and I thought there's someone carrying the same thing I've been carrying alone for 5 years. And I couldn't walk past that. I tried to tell myself it was just charity, just the decent thing to do. But that was never what it was." He stopped. A breath that cost him something. "I need you to know that. Whatever Holt does next, whatever happens, I need you to know that's what it was from the start." The fire crackled and threw light across both of them, and behind her, she could hear Eli's voice. He had come out despite everything. Of course he had. He was his mother's son, calling for her with that particular pitch of a child who needs to see you with his own eyes before he can believe you're safe. She turned her head and said, "I'm here, Eli. I'm right here." Then she turned back to Wade. She didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't need to. He could see it in her face, the thing she'd been folding and refolding and putting away in safe places for weeks, the thing that had been getting harder to put away every day. He could see it, and she let him see it, and that was enough for now. "We need to get you inside," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Help me up." She helped him up. Eli was there in seconds, pressing against her side, and she put one arm around the boy and kept the other steadying Wade, and the three of them walked back toward the house together through the cold and the smoke and the slowly dying light of the fire. And somewhere on the edge of the valley, in the dark beyond the reach of the flames, horses moved, riders, watching, waiting to see what she would do next. She already knew what she would do next. She was not finished yet. Not even close. Wade didn't sleep that night. Neither did Clara. She sat beside him on the floor of the main room with his back against the wall and 2 blankets over his shoulders, and she watched his breathing, counting it, the way she had once counted Eli's breathing during a fever winter in Missouri. That particular vigilance of a person who has decided that something matters too much to look away from. Delgado had wrapped his ribs tight. 2 cracked, maybe 3. The bruising across his left side was the deep purple-black of something that had hit hard and meant it. He was upright and breathing, and his eyes were clear, which were the 3 things that mattered. Cord was outside. He hadn't been asked to stand watch, he'd simply taken up a position by the door with his rifle and stayed there. And Clara had decided that was one of the finest things she'd seen a 22-year-old man do. At some point, close to 2 in the morning, Wade said, "You should sleep." "You should stop talking," Clara said. "Breathing is better for cracked ribs than talking." A pause. "You know that from experience. I sewed up enough ranch hands in Missouri to know more field medicine than I ever wanted to," she said. "Now be quiet." He was quiet for about 4 minutes. "They're going to come back," he said. "I know. Holt knows the federal case is moving now. He knows he can't stop it the slow way. That means he's going to try something fast." "I know," she said again. "And you're not scared." She looked at him directly. In the low light, his face was tired and honest. No walls left, no careful management of what he let show. She thought that was what pain did sometimes. It stripped a person down to what was actually there. "I'm terrified," she said. "I have been since the night I found those papers. But terror and stopped are 2 different things, Wade. They don't have to be the same thing." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Grace used to say something like that." It was the first time he'd brought her name up without being asked. Clara understood the weight of that, what it cost a man like this, to put the name of a dead woman in the same sentence as the woman sitting beside him now. She didn't treat it lightly. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Clara said. "She was," he said. "You would have liked each other. You're both too stubborn for your own good." Clara's mouth curved just slightly. "I'll take that." At dawn, 3 things happened in quick succession. The first, Francis arrived at the ranch before sunrise with Ruth Kane and Adeline Foss, and 2 men Clara didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, quiet, with the look of people who had made a decision about something and arrived to act on it. The second cord spotted fresh tracks in the mud on the north side of the property. 4 horses recently. They had circled the ranch in the night and left without approaching, which meant they had been watching, taking stock. The third, a rider came from town carrying a message that had been slipped under the door of the trading post sometime in the night. No signature. 4 words written in careful block letters that deliberately obscured any individual hand. "Leave Red Hollow today." Clara read it, folded it, put it in her pocket. Francis watched her do it. "What does it say?" "That we're winning," Clara said. "A man who wasn't worried wouldn't bother." Francis looked at the 2 men she'd brought. "These are my nephews, Tom and Garrett. They've been ranching near Laramie for 6 years. They drove through the night when I sent word." Clara looked at Tom and Garrett. They looked back at her with the steady eyes of men who had come because family asked them to. "Thank you for coming," she said. Tom shrugged one shoulder. "Francis says you're worth coming for." Clara looked at Francis. Francis said with perfect composure, "I say what I mean." Touch. Wade got to his feet at 7 in the morning by sheer determination and very little physical readiness, and when Clara opened her mouth, he held up one hand. "Don't," he said. "You have 2 cracked ribs." "I know exactly what I have." He moved carefully, measuredly, like a man navigating around pain he'd decided to work with rather than stop for. "I'm not lying on a floor while Holt decides the shape of today. That's not something I'm able to do." She looked at him for a long moment. The words that came to her mouth were not the practical ones about ribs and recovery. They were something else entirely, something that had been building since the barn, since the lantern light, since a quiet man's quiet confession in the cold of a burning night. She swallowed them back. Not yet. There was still too much unfinished between them and the rest of the world. "Then sit at the table," she said, "and let people bring the information to you instead of going to find it." He considered that as a compromise. All right. He sat at the table. Clara sat across from him. Frances and Adeline and Ruth took up space in the kitchen with the comfortable purposefulness of women who understood that crisis was most efficiently managed when everyone had something useful to do and the coffee was kept hot. Tom and Garrett went outside to join Cord. Delgado, who had not slept in 36 hours and showed no signs of planning, stood by the window and watched the north road. The twist came at 9 in the morning, and it came from a direction nobody had anticipated. Sheriff Bolin rode up to the ranch. Alone. No deputies. No Holt's men flanking him. Just Bolin himself on a bay horse riding at a pace that was careful rather than aggressive, and he tied the horse at the post and walked to the door and knocked with the knuckle rap of a man who is not sure of his welcome. Clara opened the door. Bolin looked at her. He looked worse than she'd ever seen him, not physically, but in the particular way of a man who has spent the night with something he can't set down. His eyes were red at the edges. His hat was in his hands. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "I need to speak to Mercer." "He's here," she said. She didn't move out of the doorway. "It's important." "Everything right now is important, Sheriff. Say it to me, and I'll decide if it gets to him." Bolin's jaw worked once. Then he said low enough that only she could hear. "Holt's leaving, this morning. He's got his men packing up the camp on the east side of the valley right now." He stopped. "And he's taking the signed contracts with him." Clara went very still. "All 12. The originals, yes." Bolin looked at the ground for a second. "If he gets out of the territory with those papers, the federal case gets a lot harder to make. Cook needs the originals to prove forgery copies aren't enough." He looked back up. "I know I don't have the right to ask you anything after I know what I've done these past months. I know what I let happen." His voice was rough and unsteady in a way that sounded genuine. "But if those contracts leave Wyoming today, 12 families lose everything. And Holt does this somewhere else. And I can't—" He stopped. "I can't live with that." Clara looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he started to look like a man who expected to be told no and had already begun absorbing the blow. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. Wade listened to Bolin without expression. When Bolin finished, Wade said, "Why should I trust a word out of your mouth?" It was not asked aggressively. It was asked the way Wade asked everything directly, with the expectation of an honest answer. Bolin didn't flinch from it. "You shouldn't by rights. I took his money. I looked the other way. I told myself the families could move somewhere else, start over. It wasn't my business." He was holding his hat so tightly the brim was bending. "Then last night I sat in my office and I thought about Adeline Foss's girls, 9 and 11 years old. And I thought, what kind of man sits in an office and tells himself that's not his business?" He looked at Wade steadily. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let me do the one thing that still might matter." Silence in the kitchen. Frances was watching Bolin with the focused evaluation of a woman who has spent 60 years developing an extremely accurate sense of when people are telling the truth. She said to no one in particular, "He means it." Bolin looked at her with something close to gratitude. Clara said, "Where's the camp?" "East side past the Foss property line. 2 miles. "How many men?" 4, plus Holt. She looked at Wade. He looked at her. Between them moved the particular communication of two people who have spent weeks operating in close proximity to a shared problem and have developed a language for it that doesn't require many words. "Cord Tom Garrett Delgado," Wade said. "And Bolin," Clara said. Bolin looked up. "You want to matter," she said. "This is how you matter." They moved fast. Clara wanted them on the road within 15 minutes, and they were. She stayed at the ranch with Eli and Adeline and Ruth, and she stood on the porch and watched Wade ride out, and she did something she almost never did anymore. She said a prayer. Not the formal kind she'd been raised on, but the raw, direct kind that came from the gut of a person asking for something they couldn't control, and knew it. Eli stood beside her. "He's going to be fine," Eli said. She looked down at him. "You think so?" "He went into a burning barn for a horse," Eli said with the practical certainty of an 8-year-old. "He's not going to let some land-stealing man in clean boots beat him." Clara pulled her son against her side. "No," she said. "He's not." Mid. They were back in under 2 hours. Clara heard the horses first and was at the door before any of them had dismounted. She read the faces as they came in. Cord first intact, relieved. Delgado with a cut across his forearm that he was holding carelessly the way men hold injuries they've decided not to count. Tom and Garrett with the subdued energy of men coming off something that went right. Bolin last looking like a man who had just put down something very heavy. And Wade moving carefully because of his ribs jaw set, but with his eyes clear and something in his expression that was closer to settled than she'd seen from him since the fire. He had a leather satchel in his hand. He held it up when he saw her face. "Originals," he said. Clara breathed. She actually had to grip the door frame for a second, because the release of it moved through her all at once. Weeks of careful holding. Weeks of precisely managed fear and forward motion. And it came out now in a single long exhale that she couldn't have stopped if she'd tried. "Holt," she said when she had her voice back. "Holt rode," Cord said, coming up behind Wade. "The moment he saw us coming, he cut and ran. Left 2 of his men there. They didn't put up much of a fight once they understood the sheriff was with us and not against them." "He'll try to run," Clara said. "He can try," Wade said. "But Cook's been notified. The roads out of the territory are being watched." He paused. "It's over, Clara." She looked at him. She needed to hear it again, apparently, because she said, "It's over." "It's over," he said. And the way he said it quietly, absolutely, with the full weight of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean, was the most convincing thing she had ever heard in her life. Eli pushed past her from inside and went straight to Wade, with the focused purpose of a child who has made a decision. He stopped in front of him and looked up. "Are you all right?" Eli asked. Wade crouched down slowly because of the ribs, so he was at the boy's level. "I'm all right, Eli. Your side hurts." "A little." "Mama's good at fixing things that hurt," Eli said seriously. "She fixed my arm when I broke it falling out of a tree back in Missouri. She made it stop hurting." Wade looked up at Clara over Eli's head. Something in his expression did what it had been getting closer to doing for weeks. It opened fully, and without reservation, in a way she felt like warmth spreading through a cold room. "Is that right?" he said. "It is," Clara said quietly. Marshal Cook arrived 6 days later. He was a compact, gray-haired man with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing difficult things for a long time and had stopped finding them dramatic. He rode in with 2 deputies and spent the better part of a day reviewing the documents with Clara, asking her precise, methodical questions that she answered with equal precision, and when it was done, he looked at her across Wade's kitchen table with an expression that was as close to impressed as she suspected he got. "You preserved the chain of evidence correctly," he said. "I've done mending for law offices," she said. "I know how documents are supposed to be handled." Cook almost smiled. "Where'd you learn to read contract language?" "From watching men use it against people who couldn't," she said. "Best education there is." He nodded once slowly. "Holt was picked up at the Nebraska border yesterday morning. He's in federal custody." The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. It was the silence of something finishing. "The families?" Clara asked. "The contracts?" "Null and void," Cook said. "Fraudulent instrument, fraudulent notary documented coercion. Every one of those 12 properties reverts back to its original holder." He paused. "There'll be a process, paperwork, a few months probably, but the land stays." Adeline Foss, who was sitting at the far end of the table because she had refused to not be there for this conversation, put both hands over her face and made a sound that wasn't crying exactly, but was the cousin of it. Clara reached across and put her hand over Adeline's wrist. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Wow. The weeks that followed had a different quality to them. Not peaceful exactly, because there was still work, still winter bearing down, still a barn to be partially rebuilt, and a community knitting itself back together after a long period of being slowly pulled apart. But underneath all of it was something that hadn't been there before. A foundation. Red Hollow itself seemed to exhale. With Holt gone, and Bolin, who had submitted his resignation to the county office and was quietly replaced by a man named Fletcher, who had not been bought. The town began to make different decisions. People talked to each other more. The boarding house that had been closed since Mabel died was taken over by Francis's nephews, who fixed the roof and opened it for business before December. Clara found herself increasingly at the center of something she hadn't intended to build. It started with Adeline's daughters, who needed help with their reading. She began teaching them in the ranch kitchen 3 mornings a week. Then Ruth Kane's teenage son, who could ride anything with 4 legs, but couldn't write his own name clearly enough to sign a legal document, which they had all learned mattered. Then the Novak children. Then 2 more families from the north end of the valley. Within 6 weeks, she was teaching 12 children in a room that was getting crowded. Wade watched all of this without comment for a while. Then one evening, he came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the chaos of small people and chalk slates, and Clara moving between them with the focused energy of a woman in her element, and he said, "We could clear out the front room." She looked up. "More space," he said. "Better light from the east window." She held his gaze. "That's your sitting room." "I've never sat in it once in 9 years," he said. "It's not doing anything useful." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked at the 12 children packed into her kitchen and back at him. "You'd do that," she said. Not a question. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a woman absorbing a fact about a man. "I do that," he confirmed with the absolute simplicity of someone who has stopped managing the distance between what he feels and what he says. The front room became a school. Clara put up a proper board salvaged lumber for 2 long tables, asked Francis's nephews to build benches. By the end of November 23, children were attending 3 mornings a week, and on Friday afternoons, she held a separate session for the women sewing, yes, but also reading contracts. Bookkeeping. The particular knowledge of how to understand a document before you sign it, so that no woman in this valley would ever again stand across from a man with clean boots and not know exactly what she was agreeing to. Adeline Foss called it the most important education she'd ever received. Clara called it the least she could do. Wade was recovering slowly, stubbornly in the way he did everything. The ribs healed. The bruising faded from black to green to yellow, and then to nothing. He was back to full work by December. Though Clara noticed, she noticed everything. That was the truth of it. By now she had stopped pretending she didn't, that he favored his left side when he was tired, a small unconscious protection that he probably wasn't aware of. He and Clara had settled into something that neither of them had named. It was not the arrangement they'd started with, where she cooked, and he provided shelter, and they were careful and deliberate with each other. It was something that had grown slowly and steadily, and without announcement, into the shape of 2 people who had stopped performing self-sufficiency in front of each other. He told her things, not everything. Not all at once, he was still. Wade, still a man, who moved carefully around the interior of himself, but more than before. About the ranch, about his decisions, about the grief that had built the walls of this house for 5 years, and was slowly, stone by stone, being disassembled by the presence of a woman who never asked him to be different, just present. She told him things, too. About Thomas, the real Thomas, not the martyr she'd briefly tried to make him in her mind, but the actual man, flawed and charming, and ultimately careless with the things she'd needed him to protect. About the debt and the running and the 11 months of holding herself together by sheer refusal. about the particular loneliness of being a woman who is competent enough that people assume she needs nothing. "I got good at not needing things," she said one evening. They were at the table after dinner, Eli long since in bed, the house quiet around them. "It was survival, but I got so good at it, I almost forgot how to want things." "What do you want?" Wade asked, directly, the way he asked everything. She looked at him across the table. "This," she said. And she meant the school, the community, the work, the purpose, all of it. She meant all of it. But she also meant the table and the lantern and the man sitting across from her with his coffee going cold because he'd been listening to her too carefully to remember to drink it. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "Good. Just that. Good." That meant everything he wasn't saying yet, and she heard every word of it. It was Eli who finally said what both adults were carefully, mutually, and slightly ridiculously refusing to. He was helping Delgado with the horses one Saturday morning when Clara came out to call him for lessons, and she overheard him say in the casual, matter-of-fact tone of a 9-year-old boy conducting what he considered a reasonable conversation, "I think Mama's happy here. She doesn't make the face anymore." Delgado, without looking up from the saddle he was cleaning, said, "What face?" "The one she made every morning in Missouri," Eli said. "Like she was getting ready to lift something very heavy." He paused. "She doesn't make it anymore. Not since we came here." Clara stood very still outside the barn door. "No," Delgado said thoughtfully. "She doesn't." "I think it's because of Wade," Eli said with complete confidence. "He makes her not have to lift everything by herself." There was a pause in which Delgado apparently devoted complete attention to the saddle. "You're a very observant young man," Delgado said finally. "Mama says that too," Eli said. "Usually right before she tells me to mind my own business." Clara walked away from the barn doorway before either of them could see her, and she stood in the cold for a moment, with her hand pressed to her chest, over the particular ache that lives just below joy, just above fear, in the place where something true is trying to make itself known. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely going to cry. She gave herself exactly 15 seconds, standing in the cold Wyoming morning, with her eyes stinging and her heart doing something it hadn't done in a very long time. Then she straightened up, smoothed her coat, and went back inside to start the school day. Spring came to Red Hollow the way it always came to Wyoming. Not gently, not with any particular announcement, but suddenly and completely, like a decision that had finally been made. The snow was still on the north-facing slopes when the first real warmth arrived, and Clara noticed it the morning she walked out to call the children in for lessons, and realized she wasn't bracing against the cold anymore. She was just walking. Her coat was open. Her hands were loose at her sides. She stood there for a moment and felt the sun on her face, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off a wagon into the rain 11 months ago with a soaked suitcase and a child and nothing else worth counting. She barely recognized her, not because she had become someone different, but because she had become finally and completely someone real. Not the managed version, not the surviving version, not the woman who packed her grief into neat compartments every morning so it wouldn't interfere with the work of staying alive. Just herself. Here, in the sun, in Wyoming, on a ranch that had stopped feeling borrowed. She didn't let herself think about what she was about to do. She had been not thinking about it for 3 days, which was how she'd always handled the things that mattered most. Hold them carefully at the edge of her awareness until the moment came, then step forward without flinching. The moment was today. She went inside and taught school. Wade found her that afternoon. He came in from the east fence line where he and Cord had been restringing wire since morning, and he was tired in the productive way, the specific exhaustion of a man who has worked his body honestly and is satisfied with what it's done. He poured water from the pitcher and drank half of it standing at the counter, and when he turned around, Clara was sitting at the table with her hands folded and an expression he recognized. It was the expression she wore when she'd made a decision about something important, and was being careful about how she put it into the world. He set the cup down. "What happened?" "Nothing happened," she said. "Sit down, Wade." He sat. She looked at him across the table. This man who had walked through the rain toward a stranger, who had given shelter without conditions, who had sat across from her in lantern light, going through documents that could have gotten him killed without once asking whether it was worth it. This man who had gone into a burning barn and come out broken-ribbed and still standing, who had cleared out his sitting room for a school without being asked, who said things like, "I'd do that," in a voice that meant I'd do anything, and never made her feel like it was a weight he was keeping track of. "I need to say something to you," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond. Can you do that?" He nodded once. She took a breath. "When I came here, I had made a decision about men," she said. "Not a bitter one, I want to be clear about that, just a practical one. I'd had a husband who was charming and careless, and loved me the way some people love things enthusiastically while they're new and with less attention as time goes on. I had learned to be self-sufficient because self-sufficient meant protected. It meant I would not be standing somewhere waiting for someone to hold me up and finding out too late they had somewhere else to be." She paused. "I was very committed to that decision." Wade was watching her with the absolute stillness that meant he was hearing every word. "And then you," she said. "You didn't try to impress me or convince me or make me trust you. You just were, consistently, without asking for anything back. You were the same man in the rain, as you were at the table at midnight, as you were in the burning barn, and that—" She stopped for a second because something in her chest was making speech more difficult than she'd planned for. "That is an extremely rare thing, Wade. I want you to know I understand how rare it is." He was very still. "I'm not good at needing things," she said. "I told you that. But Eli told Delgado something last month that I wasn't supposed to hear, and what he said was—" She paused. "He said you make me not have to lift everything by myself." The silence between them was the held breath kind. "He's 9 years old, and he's already wiser than I've been giving him credit for," she said. "And I've been sitting with that for 3 weeks trying to figure out if I was ready to say it out loud. And the truth is, I don't know if I'll ever feel entirely ready, so I've decided to say it anyway." She met his eyes directly and held them. "I love you, Wade Mercer. Not because you saved me, I was saving myself, but because you made it possible for me to stop doing it alone. And that is the most significant thing anyone has ever given me." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, completely full, pressing at the edges of the room with everything that had been building since a rainy October night, and a porch, and a man who recognized loneliness because he was fluent in it. Wade stood up. He walked around the table. He stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and he reached down and took both her hands in his, not dramatically, just firmly, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has decided on something and is done taking his time about it. "Clara," he said, "I've been in love with you since the night you looked at those documents and said those women needed to know what they signed." He paused. "Maybe before that. Maybe since you told me in the rain you were not a woman who went quietly." A long breath. "I didn't say it because I wasn't sure I had the right to. Because you came here carrying so much already, and I didn't want to be one more thing you had to manage." She stood up. They were close enough now that she had to tilt her face up to look at him properly. "You have never been one more thing," she said. He lifted one hand to her face, the calloused, weathered hand of a man who had worked this land for 15 years, holding her jaw with a gentleness completely at odds with its roughness, and he kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not the kind written in dime novels. It was quiet and absolute, and it tasted like coffee and the end of a very long winter, and when it was done, they stood with their foreheads together, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was simply nothing left that needed saying. Then from the doorway came a sound. A small sound, deliberately loud. They both looked. Eli was standing there with his arms crossed and the expression of a 9-year-old boy who has been vindicated by events and intends to enjoy it. "Finally," he said. The proposal came 6 weeks later. Clara had been expecting it for roughly 3 of those 6 weeks, not because Wade had given any obvious indication, but because she had learned to read him, had learned the particular quality of the silences he had when he was working something out internally. And there had been a lot of those silences lately. What she had not expected was the where. He asked her beside the barn. The rebuilt barn, new timber straight walls, the smell of fresh-cut wood, still present, if you stood close enough, which Clara always did. He had built it back better than the fire had found it, with wider doors, and a hayloft that actually held weight, and he had put it up with Cord and Delgado, and Tom and Garrett, and 6 other men from the valley who had shown up on a Saturday morning with tools, and no explanation, except that Wade Mercer had stood beside them when it mattered, and now they were standing beside him. It was a Sunday morning in late April. Eli was inside with Delgado. The sky was the particular clear blue that Wyoming reserved for days it wanted you to remember. Wade stopped walking beside the barn wall and turned to face her. He didn't get on one knee. He just looked at her directly and said, "Marry me." Just that. 2 words. No speech prepared, no elaborate preamble. Pure Wade. Clara looked at him. She felt the fullness of it, the weight of what this moment held, not just for her, but for both of them. 2 people who had each been living in the aftermath of loss and had found improbably and without planning something worth choosing again. "Not because you need saving," he said. "You never needed that. You never needed me to fix a single thing." He paused, and what moved through his expression was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human face. "But because every morning I wake up and the first thought I have is that you're in this house, and that makes the day worth something. And I don't want to go back to mornings without that, not for any price." Clara breathed. "Yes," she said. No hesitation, no qualification, no carefully managed emotion, just yes, clean and complete and entirely hers. Wade put his arms around her, and she let him, and she felt, truly felt all the way down the reality of not being alone anymore, not the absence of solitude, the presence of something chosen. It was a different thing entirely. Word spread through Red Hollow the way good news always travels faster than bad. By evening, Frances had organized a dinner at the church hall. By morning, Adeline had brought a quilt she'd been making for 3 months that Clara realized with a rush of feeling had been intended for this all along. "You knew," Clara said. Adeline shrugged with perfect innocence. "I had a feeling." "You all had a feeling," Clara said. "Delgado knew before Christmas," Adeline said cheerfully. "He won the pool." There was a pool. There was absolutely a pool. Cord thought February. Frances said March. Delgado said spring. She smiled. "He's a very perceptive man." Clara put her face in her hands briefly. Then she laughed. Really laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded, the kind she had almost forgotten the sound of. It was, she thought, an extremely good sound. Yes. They were married on the first Saturday of May, in the same church hall that 3 months earlier had been the site of the confrontation that changed everything. Preacher Mills performed the service. Every family on the original document list was there. The Novaks brought food Clara didn't recognize, and which tasted extraordinary. Ruth Kane's teenage son Henry, who could now write his name clearly, and was working through his first full book, stood in the back and looked like a young man storing something away for later. Eli stood beside Wade at the front of the room. He had asked to 3 days before the ceremony, with the same direct simplicity he'd inherited from his mother. "Can I stand up there with you?" he'd asked Wade. Wade had looked at him for a moment. Then he crouched down. His ribs had healed entirely by now, no more careful favoring, and said, "I was hoping you'd want to." Eli had nodded satisfied and gone back to his reading. At the ceremony, when Preacher Mills pronounced them married, and Wade kissed Clara for the second time in her life, the first being the kitchen, the second being in front of everyone who mattered in the valley of Red Hollow, Wyoming, Eli started clapping first. Not politely, with genuine enthusiasm and no self-consciousness whatsoever. Delgado clapped him on the shoulder. Cord whistled. Frances wept exactly 2 tears and then straightened her spine with complete composure and pretended it had not happened. And Clara, who had arrived in this town with nothing, stood in the middle of all of it and felt home. Not the house, not the building, The people. The accumulated weight of everything they had built together. All of it real, none of it accidental. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived 4 months into their marriage on a Tuesday morning when Marshall Cook sent a letter. Clara read it at the kitchen table while Wade watched her face. She looked up. "Holt's lawyers are challenging the federal case," she said. "They're arguing the testimony collected from the families was improperly gathered. No legal counsel present, no formal documentation protocol." She set the letter down. If the challenge succeeds, the contracts could be reinstated. Wade was very still. "They can't do that," Cord said from the doorway, because Cord had developed a habit of appearing in doorways at critical moments that Clara had long since stopped questioning. "They're trying to," she said. She looked at the letter again. At the name Cook had included at the bottom a contact, a recommendation. A lawyer in Cheyenne who handled federal land cases and had a specific interest in railroad fraud. She looked at the name for a long time. Then she looked at Wade. "We need Eli," she said. Wade frowned. "He's 9 years old, Clara. He's 9 years old and he can read and write and understand a document better than half the adults in this valley," she said. "Not him specifically, but this." She touched the letter. "This is what I've been teaching for. This is why the school matters. Not just reading, not just sewing. The ability to stand in front of a legal challenge and not be afraid of it because you understand it." She stood up. "I'm going to write to this lawyer, and I'm going to send him everything I documented, every conversation, every date, every observation I made in those weeks. All of it in order with dates." "You kept records," Wade said slowly. "I kept records of everything," she said. "Since the first night, in the ledger book in the sideboard." She paused. "The one next to where you found the documents." He stared at her. "You've had a documented record of this entire case since the beginning," he said. "I've done mending for law offices," she said simply. "I know how evidence works." There was a beat of silence, in which Wade appeared to be recalibrating something fundamental about the woman he had married, despite having already had considerable time to adjust to who she was. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I'm practical," she said. "Send for Delgado. I'm going to need someone to ride to Cheyenne." What? The legal challenge collapsed within 6 weeks. Clara's documentation was meticulous dates, exact wording of conversations. The physical observations about the notary seal recorded in her own hand. On the night she'd first found it, all of it organized and cross-referenced with a clarity that the Cheyenne lawyer, a methodical man named Arthur Pennick, who had fought 3 similar cases in 2 territories, called the most useful private record he had ever received from a civilian witness. He said it in a letter. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and put it with the others. The families kept their land, every single one of them. Holt was convicted in federal court in September. The sentence was 7 years. The news reached Red Hollow on a Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon it had traveled to every family in the valley. And that evening, people gathered at the church hall without being organized to do so. Not for a celebration exactly, but for the particular human need to be together when something long feared finally becomes something finished. Clara sat with Wade and Eli and Adeline and Francis and Delgado and Cord and Ruth and the Novaks and Herschel Pruitt, who had driven his wagon 3 miles to be there, and she looked around the room at all of it. All these lives that were still here, still intact, still continuing, and she felt the full quiet weight of what they had done. Not she alone, not Wade alone, all of them together. "You all right?" Wade asked quietly beside her. "Better than all right," she said. He put his hand over hers on the table. She turned hers over and held it. Years moved the way good years do, faster than the hard ones, and fuller. The school grew. Clara formalized it applied to the territorial board for a modest educational charter, which Francis and Adeline helped her write, and which was approved the following spring. She hired a second teacher, a young woman named Josephine, who had come west from Ohio with a college education and no immediate prospects, and who turned out to be precisely the kind of person Clara had always believed existed in abundance if you looked in the right places. The women's sessions continued every Friday. They evolved. The sewing remained because sewing was practical and there was never nothing to mend. But the contract literacy sessions became something that women rode 2 hours to attend because the word had gotten out that in Red Hollow there was a woman who would sit across from you with a document and explain every line of it until you understood what you were agreeing to, and that no question was too basic and no woman too old to learn. Adeline Foss's daughters grew up attending Clara's school. The older one, a fierce girl named May, announced at 14 that she intended to be a lawyer. Clara told her to study hard and mean it, and May did both. Eli grew. He grew the way Clara had always hoped he would, not just in size, but in substance, in the particular depth of a person who has seen hard things young and has been surrounded by people who met those hard things with purpose instead of surrender. He was quiet like Wade. He was direct like Clara. He read everything he could put his hands on, and when he was 16, he rode to Cheyenne and presented himself at Arthur Pennock's law office and asked if he could read case files in exchange for running errands. Pennock said yes. He always said later that it was the best decision he made that decade. Eli came home every few months. He sat at the kitchen table where everything had happened, and he talked to Wade about land and cattle and the slow evolution of territory into statehood, and he talked to Clara about law and justice and the particular mechanics of protecting people who didn't know they needed protecting. And Wade and Clara listened and asked questions and watched their son with the quiet, full-hearted attention of parents who know they have done something right. Tug. Wade's ribs never quite forgot the fire. On very cold mornings, he moved carefully until he'd been up long enough for the stiffness to work out, and Clara always had the coffee ready before he came in. And he always came to the kitchen first, and neither of them had ever discussed this arrangement, because it had simply become the language of their mornings. On one of those mornings, a January morning snow, heavy on the eaves, Eli grown and practicing law in Cheyenne, the house quiet, with the particular fullness of a life that has been lived rather than merely survived. Wade came in and poured his coffee and stood at the window, looking out at the rebuilt barn and the snow-covered yard and the tracks of small animals crossing the white. "You know what I thought about last night?" he said. Clara looked up from the bread she was working. "What?" "That night in the rain," he said, "when I walked across the street." She was quiet. "I almost didn't," he said. "I stood there for a long time telling myself it wasn't my business, that you'd find your way, that getting involved in other people's problems was a good way to get pulled into things you couldn't finish." He turned from the window and looked at her. "And then I thought she's not going to ask. And if I don't move, nobody will." "And you moved," Clara said. "And I moved," he said. She set down the bread. She crossed the kitchen. She stood in front of him the way she had stood in front of him 100 times in this room, directly without pretense. Everything she felt fully present in her face. "Best thing you ever did," she said. He looked at her with those dark eyes that had stopped managing what they showed her years ago. "Best thing I ever did," he agreed. He kissed her not the first time, not even close to the last, but with the same absolute quality. It had always had the quality of something chosen fully and without reservation. Outside, snow fell on the rebuilt barn and the yard and the road that led into Red Hollow, which had grown in 20 years from a dying cattle town into something with a school and a church and a proper doctor, and a reputation for the kind of fairness that comes when a community decides collectively and deliberately what it stands for. That decision had a name. Several names, really. But the one people mentioned first still was Clara Whitmore Mercer, the widow who had arrived with nothing and left nothing unchanged. She had come looking for shelter. She had found something immeasurably larger than that, and the life she had built from one cold October night forward: the school, the families, the love, the son who would spend his career protecting people. The way his mother once protected him proved something that Red Hollow understood long before it could articulate it. The people who arrive at your door with nothing left are not a burden on a community. They are the ones who save it. And sometimes the shelter you offer a stranger in the rain is the beginning of everything worth building, every single time.